Hi YouTube, how are you today? That's great. So every year I like to do a special video at the end of the year. Just because I do a lot of educational videos throughout the year, I like to do a special fun one to kind of thank the students for putting up with the educational videos throughout the year and to have some fun with it and do a YouTube style traditional video and do something that everyone will just have fun watching. And so when trying to figure out what I was going to do this year, I had an advisee suggest a bunch of things. And one of the things that I was suggested was to do a tier list. And I thought, okay, what would I do a tier list on? And I started thinking maybe like math subjects. And so, but I was like, well, math classes, there are just like 5 or 6 or 7 that like we really could do. I want something a bit more broad, and I was trying to think of like how I could break those down a bit, and then I thought math team. In math team, we have categories that we do at each meet. And each meet has 5 categories, so that would bring it to 25 different categories. And a lot of these categories are subjects you see throughout your high school math classes. So I thought that would be perfect. It combines math team with math in general, so everyone can understand the subjects we're talking about. A lot of people have seen things like these. And hopefully it'll get more people interested in math team and seeing maybe what some of the more fun categories are. And I don't know. Hopefully this gets more people to join math team. So join math team. All right, so I'm going to do this tier list, and I think I just took the traditional rankings that I've seen on tier list videos. There's an S tier, which is the really, really good, the super tier, if you will, and then normal grades A, B, C, D, and F. And so as I mentioned, there are 5 meets, and each meet has 5 categories. So I have them all listed right here, and so the first 5 are meet 1. This usually happens sometime in October, usually the beginning of October, so we have the first month of school to prepare for meet 1, and then we have meet 1. So these first 5 categories are meet 1. And I've always thought of meet 1 as probably, of the 5 regular season meets, probably the easiest one. I always say the Mid-Main Invitational that we have after the regular season is probably the easiest and probably the most fun. But meet 1 is definitely the easiest. So I always try to get people, when they're joining math team, join as early as possible, because that's when a lot of the more fun categories come up, and probably the more easier ones to understand, especially if you don't have a lot of math background. So I'm going to start, and I'm just going to go in order. These are in order based on the 5 meets. So the first 5 categories are meet 1. And they also, they have an order to them, and this is the order I do them in practices. So the very first practice, I do arithmetic with star operations. The second practice, I do inequalities and absolute values. And I keep going, and usually we'll have 5 practices before a meet. So I'm going to do them in the same order. So if you were to ever attend a practice, if you come to the first one, we're going to be doing arithmetic with star operations. If you come to the second, we'll be doing inequalities and absolute values, and so on. So also can show people kind of what you're getting into depending on which practice might be your first one to show up, or if you're showing up to that practice, what you might be able to expect. So without further ado, let's get started. So arithmetic with star operations. Right out of the bat, this is one of my favorites. Arithmetic with star operations, all you need to know is substitution, being able to substitute things in. And I'm just right out of the bat, I'm going to put this in S tier. Part of me thought about putting it in A tier, where if you just go in and you're handed the meat, you're probably going to have no idea what they're talking about. So that part of me thought about putting it in A tier instead. But if you get even just a little bit of instruction, I think most people will be able to take off with it because it's just substituting in. You get a star and it says 5 star 4, and then it says A star B means this. And then you're just substituting in, you're plugging things in. And it's some of the basic things you can do in math, and it's just kind of done a different way than you've seen in high school. So that's why a lot of people can be scared of it, but it's so much fun once you just get even a little bit of understanding what to do. It's super easy and a lot of fun. So this is actually one of my favorite categories. Next is inequalities and absolute values. And after the very first practice, having one of my favorites, inequalities and absolute values, I'm putting it C tier. Like, it's not too bad. Like, the 3-pointers, and by the way, the math team is usually done 3-pointer, 4-pointer, 5-pointer, where the 3-pointers are pretty doable for most people. The 4-pointers take a lot of work, and the 5-pointers sometimes I have trouble with. So just so people know that going in, but the 3-pointers are doable. They're usually like an inequality or an absolute value, maybe an inequality absolute value. Those are usually not too bad, but when you get to the 4 or 5-pointers, you get to ones where it's usually an absolute value on both sides and with an inequality in the middle. And what you have to do there is, after solving, like you do all the work to solving, then you have to go back and check every critical value to see if it works. And they just take so long and are so annoying. And so, like, again, the 3-pointers aren't too bad. Most people can get those with little problem, but once you get past the 3-pointers, the rest, they're just headaches. Next, matrices, determinants, and systems of equations. That's going in D tier. Systems of equations aren't too bad. A lot of people get them in Algebra 1, and if not Algebra 1, Algebra 2. So, and I've even seen middle schoolers, like a lot of middle school classes go into system of equations. And if it was just systems of equations, I'd have this much higher, maybe A or B tier. But you're throwing matrices and determinants in there. And when I was in high school, we learned matrices. And in Algebra 2, we don't teach matrices anymore. Like, most curriculums I've seen, even in other schools, we don't do matrices anymore because they're used a lot in computer science and a few other areas, and that's kind of it. And so they're not touched on a lot, and outside of those areas, they just don't get covered all that much. So they're usually either the last thing to be thought about or just not even in the curriculum. Don't even think about them. And I mean, addition and subtraction of matrices are super easy, and a 2x2 determinant isn't bad. But then the 3x3 determinants, you have to memorize a bit. And hopefully they don't put a 4x4 on there because those are crazy. And then multiplying matrices are just so much. There's just so much going on. And I understand why they put them all in one category, because you can use matrices to solve systems of equations. But usually if we get a system of equations, we're solving it using algebra. And if we get a matrix, we're solving it using matrix math. So putting them together, yes, they have some similarities to them. Yes, you can use matrices to solve systems of equations, but that doesn't usually happen. And matrices and determinants can be a lot, especially in Meat 1. It This can scare a lot of people off because it's a lot. So this is definitely not one of my favorite categories. Next is number theory. This one is an S tier. This is not even up to algebra. Like, a lot of these questions can be done with simple arithmetic. But there's also like knowing division rules, knowing like if something is divisible by 2, how do you find that out? Well, it's because it's even. How do we know if it's divisible by 3? Well, you can add up the digits and then that number is divisible by 3. Divisible by 5 is that the number ends in 5 or 0. Even being divisible by 9, the numbers will add up and be divisible by 9. So a lot of that is just using those, and like I said, a lot of these you can solve without even knowing that stuff. You can just brute force it and get to the answer. And there's a lot of different ways to solve these problems, and they're so much fun. And the rules that you need to know aren't that bad either. So if you get to the rules that, well, you actually don't need to know them. Like I said, you could brute force it. But if you want to know the rules, they're actually not that bad either and can get you to the problems quicker. So number theory is a really fun category and also one of my favorites. Geometric similarities, I'm going to put at A tier. I really like geometric similarities, and I'm not even usually a big fan of geometry. I know I've taught it for 8 years, but like I always had a hard time when I was learning it in high school. I didn't work. My brain didn't work that way with understanding the shapes. But geometric similarities is mainly just proportions and knowing those, and they're a lot of fun. And they always try to throw like tricks at you by going with ones that have length and area in them, and as long as you know that you gotta square the length in the ratio, they're not that bad. So you just gotta understand that part. But it's really not that bad. It's definitely nowhere near one of my favorites, but it's still not that bad. And it's also a calculator active category, so people like those a lot because they get to use their calculator on those ones. All right, so that's Meat 1. That's what Meat 1 looks like. We've got 2 in the S tier, 1 in the A tier, and then 1 in the C, 1 in the D. Like I said, not too bad. Those top 3 are really good, and a lot of people get them pretty easily, and they're a lot of fun. I kind of wish we would see more like those later on, and we do get some, but those are just the most fun. Those top 3 are a lot of fun to do and easy to get a handle on. So now we're going to go with Meat 2. Meat 2 usually happens around the beginning of November, and it's the next 5 categories we're going to deal with. So arithmetic with ratio and proportion. That one I'm going to put in S tier. It's a lot of what we dealt with in geometric similarities with dealing with proportions. So it's a lot of stuff we've already seen, but it's not specific to just geometry. It's just anything where we'll have ratio and proportion. And you'll kind of see me putting a lot of the arithmetic pretty high because the arithmetic categories, like I said, they just use arithmetic to solve them. And so arithmetic with ratio and proportion, it's a lot of basic stuff, and it doesn't take a lot of outside knowledge to know, and it's a lot of fun. All right, next we have series and sequences. This one is going to be my first one I put in B tier. A lot of series and sequences, you need the formulas for. There's a lot of formulas to answer questions, and it's hard to remember a lot of those formulas, and a lot of people struggle with them. However, there's a lot of them that you can actually figure out without the formulas, and some that you actually don't even need the formulas for. You can't, like, the formulas wouldn't even be of help to you. It's just brute force. So, understanding if you've got a series of 1, 3, 5, 7, something like that, like, what is the 25th term going to be? You could count it out and figure it out that way. And so you don't need the formula. The formulas make them a lot easier, but they can be done just by brute forcing it. So that's why I'm putting it at B tier. It's definitely not one of my favorites with all the formulas, and some, like, it's just going to take you way too long, more than the 12 minutes that a normal round allows you to. But there are many questions that are quick and easy that all you have to do is brute force, and you'll get it even without the formula. Next, counting principles and binomial theorem. You'll see this a lot where when they combine things, multiple different things, I'm not a huge fan. So if it was just counting principles, I would put this pretty high, because counting principles are a lot of fun, and they're pretty easy once you know the very basic formula. So counting principles are great. If it was just counting principles, this would be S or A tier probably for me. You throw the binomial theorem in there, and it just makes it much lower. Like, yes, you use combinations, which is a big part of counting principles in the binomial theorem, but it adds this part of polynomials where a lot of people don't learn that till algebra 2. So if we've got people who are in algebra 1 or geometry that are on the math team, the binomial theorem is just going to be way too far advanced for anything they've dealt with. And even for me, like, it's just annoying. It's a lot of work and takes a lot of time to get the answers. They aren't a lot of fun. So I'm going to put that category down at D tier. Polynomials, I could probably see it at D tier, but I'm going to put it at C tier. Again, like I said, you don't usually deal with a lot of polynomials till you get to algebra 2, and possibly even further for some of the polynomial stuff. So the fact that it's like Meet 2, it's still pretty early in the year, and you've got a lot of people in algebra 1 and geometry who may not even know what a polynomial is. So I'm not a huge fan of this category. Some of them aren't bad, where it's just adding and subtracting polynomials. Some of the very basic three-pointers are doable, but a lot of them involve factoring, and factoring you usually don't get to until algebra 2, maybe well into algebra 2. And last category of Meet 2 is areas and volumes, and that I'm going to put at B tier. It's mostly knowing the formulas, and if it's just knowing formulas, I'm not usually a huge fan. It's not great just for the memorization, but there are some nice things with areas and volumes. Specifically volumes is that there are really just some basic shapes, and a lot of times they give you all the formulas for all the different kinds, but you can always break them down into one. For example, you've got prisms. Prisms are just area of the base times the height. And so if that's a triangular prism, or a rectangular prism, a hexagonal prism, no matter what, it's the area of the base times the height. And that also goes with cylinders. Cylinders are just a circular prism. So you find the area of the circle, multiply it by the height, and that's it. That's the volume. And so a lot of people think they have to remember this other formula for cylinders, or maybe even different formulas for triangular prisms, rectangular prisms, hexagonal prisms. No, all you need to remember is area of the base times the height for any prism. And then there's pyramids. So again, triangular pyramid, rectangular pyramid, hexagonal pyramid, doesn't matter. That's 1/3 area of the base times the height. And that goes the same for cones. Cones are just a circular pyramid. So you do 1/3 area of the circle times the height, and that's the volume of the cone. And then you just need to remember the volume of a sphere, which is a completely different thing. So it's breaking down all these different kinds of shapes into just 3. So I like it so it's not that bad. Again, it is remembering formulas, and you also have to remember the formulas for different areas of shapes, and then there's even surface areas. So there's a lot going on there, but it's really not too bad. And again, this is a calculator active category, so a lot of the big numbers that you're usually dealing with, you can get done with using a calculator. All right, so now we're going to deal with Meet 3. The next 5 categories are Meet 3. This usually happens in December. So the first category of Meet 3 is probability. And you'll probably have heard this before, but I'm not a huge fan of stats, and like probability is a big portion of that. I think probability can be difficult a lot. But I think the math team actually I think does a really good job of it. A lot of the categories I think they make too difficult. Probability, I don't think they do. People may disagree with me on that, but I actually am going to put probability up in A tier. And a lot of the probability is just the basic probability, number of things you want out of total number of things, or maybe dealing with a compound probability where you need to deal with the probability of this or this, and you just add the probabilities. Or if you're dealing with the probability of this and this happening at the same time, and then you multiply the probabilities. They're usually not too bad. Some will get you a little bit farther and have to deal with binomials possibly. But overall, I think probability is a fun category that a lot of people can do without knowing a whole lot. And it's easy to just teach those things that you do need to know. Exponents and radicals. I'm going to put that at C tier. I think it deals a lot with fractions. There's a lot of fractions going on because radicals are just fractional exponents. And so a lot of people just have trouble working with the fractions. And there's a lot going on with getting to where you need to go with exponents and solving the equations using the exponents and the radicals. There's a lot of simplifying. It can be difficult, and this is one of the categories I think they make harder than they need to. So I'm putting that at C tier. Lines, angles, and polygons. I know. I'm not usually a fan of geometry, but I'm putting a lot of the geometries kind of high. So lines, angles, and polygons, I'm putting in B tier. There's a couple formulas you need to know for the measure of angles in specific polygons and the number of diagonals. But then after that, a lot of it isn't too bad. A lot of it uses parallel line stuff that you learn in geometry, and knowing that all the angles in a triangle add up to 180, like that's a lot of the basic information you need to know. It's not like super easy. That's not why I'm putting it at a higher tier. And we don't usually in geometry teach a lot of the polygon stuff on knowing the number of degrees in shapes outside a triangle, or even going into exterior angles or diagonals or anything like that. But a lot of the stuff is covered a lot in geometry, and it's, even if you haven't taken geometry yet, it's doable to figure out pretty quickly. All right, next we have complex numbers. So you don't learn complex numbers until Algebra 2, and possibly even late in Algebra 2. I'm putting that in S tier. Complex numbers are a lot of fun, and while a lot of people probably haven't dealt with them that I'm getting at Math Team, a lot of people who are still in Algebra 1 or Geometry, it's a lot easy for them to figure out. It takes very little teaching to get it, and then they're just a lot of fun to deal with. Complex numbers is a very fun category, so it's also one of my favorites. Arithmetic with percent. I'm putting a lot in S tier, but again, it's an arithmetic category. It just takes basic arithmetic. It's even a calculator active round, so you deal with a lot of big numbers. It's just using the calculator, and the biggest thing you need to know in that is that percent increase is just 1 plus whatever the percent is, and then multiply that number by what you're dealing with. Percent decrease is 1 minus the percent you're dealing with, and then multiply that number with the number you're dealing with. A lot of people don't understand that, and they try to do too far, and it can get confusing. If you know that one little trick, it's super easy, and it's really not that bad of a category, and a lot of people are scared of it, but it's really decent. All right, now we have Meet 4. Meet 4 usually happens near the end of January, so after the break. And so this is where the meets get significantly harder, in my opinion. And less of the categories are going to be the top stuff, because this is where stuff gets real. So arithmetic with literal equations is the only arithmetic category I'm putting very low, and it's not even super low because it's still arithmetic, but I wouldn't say it's super arithmetic. It definitely has a good amount of algebra in it. I really think it should be algebra with literal equations, but it's solving equations just like you normally would, but pretty much everything in there is a letter. So, for example, ax plus b equals c, solve for a. Something like that. So, for one, it can scare people with all letters, no numbers, but then at the same time, there's usually one trick that involves factoring, and a lot of people haven't seen factoring. It's just factoring out a common factor, but because a lot of people haven't seen that, and factoring is a thing that takes a lot more work than people think, it can confuse a lot of people, and knowing to do that one thing can be difficult. And I know when I'm trying to teach it, like, people get it, but it takes a lot longer for people to get than others. So that's why I'm throwing that one at B tier. All right, logs and log equations. You don't usually learn logarithms till pre-calc, and sometimes maybe not even until calculus. And so they're a lot. There's a lot going on with them, and it's like exponents and radicals, but raised to the extreme. And so logs and log equations is D tier for me. It's very difficult. I mean, you can... The 3-pointers are doable at times, where it's just knowing how to turn a log equation into an exponential equation. But even that can sometimes confuse people. It actually a lot of times confuse people. So that's one of the lower ones for me. Linear coordinate geometry is not really geometry. It's graphing algebra, but it's the geometry portion of algebra. It's all about coordinate grids and being able to graph on a coordinate grid. So it's a lot of knowing slope, y equals mx plus b, a lot of parallel and perpendicular lines and knowing what those slopes mean. So it's a lot of stuff from that. It is Algebra 1. A lot of that stuff you cover in Algebra 1, but it's like the part of Algebra 1 people have the hardest time with, or at least I did. So I put that lower in the C tier. Next we have functions. Let's have some fun with functions. It's an S tier for me. Functions are a lot of fun. They really are. And it's just a lot of operations with functions, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, and even composite functions aren't that bad, where it's just plugging a function into a function. And you do have to do some teaching with it beforehand, but they're really not that bad, and like I have a lot of fun with them. All right, next, trig mechanics. I could put this in D tier, but I'm gonna put it in C tier. Trig is something a lot of people just have trouble with. You don't learn it until geometry, but even then it's towards the end, and I know when I'm teaching it, a lot of times I don't even get to it. And so you could get to in Algebra 2, but a lot of times that doesn't happen. So then the first time you could see it is in like a pre-calc class. And sometimes you don't even cover it a lot then, and you won't get it till a lot of it till calculus. So it kind of depends. So we go into a lot of meets where there's just a lot of people that don't know how to do trig mechanics. It's really not too bad, sine, cosine, and tangent. Just knowing SOHCAHTOA, sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, tangent is opposite over adjacent. And if you know those, and you know how to work trig in your calculator, it's not too bad. That's why I put it at C tier. But there's just a lot of people that they're just not going to get it by the time of the meet. And it's a category that a lot of people just score 0 on. All right, and then we're at meet 5. Everyone knows how I feel about meet 5. It's the toughest meet. Most of the categories are pretty awful, and they put them all at the end. And I really hate it when we have people who join like right towards the end, join math team right towards the end, and they get to meet 5, and they're like, oh my god, this is horrible. I can't do this. It's so hard. That's because these are the really hard categories. We get a lot of people that score 0 points at meet 5. And I try to explain that for any new people joining or people who are pretty new, that meet 5 is just very difficult. So with that, we have algebraic fractions with factoring. Again, it's a lot of factoring, and factoring usually doesn't get covered till Algebra 2, so it's hard to explain factoring, especially quadratic factoring, when a doesn't equal 1. That can be very difficult, and a lot of problems have to do with that. Aren't usually too bad, because they'll usually have fractions where all of the denominators have all factors. So usually if you've got a quadratic and 2 binomials, the 2 binomials will multiply to be that quadratic. So you usually don't even have to factor in that case. So that's why I only put it at C tier instead of D tier, but it's still there's a lot of factoring you need to do, and it's a lot to understand. Trig equations and identities. D tier. Again, it combines a couple things, trig equations and trig identities. If it was just one or the other, I'd put it a bit higher. Trig identities can be a lot of fun when you know the identities, at least the basic ones, the reciprocal and Pythagorean identities. Those really aren't too bad. But then trig equations requires knowing the unit circle. And the unit circle, again, isn't too bad if you know it very well. And you don't have to memorize it either. Knowing some very basic parts of it, you can easily figure out the rest just fine. But you're going to have to, in this category, be able to solve a trigonometric equation, then maybe perform an identity on it, then use the unit circle to figure out what that is. All of that combined into one category, no thank you. It's a lot. And people who have never seen trig before, like the trig identities and even the trig equation stuff, we don't deal with those until very end of algebra 2, maybe end of pre-calc, maybe the beginning of calculus. Like it just doesn't get covered a lot, and it's a lot to understand when you're just trying to prepare for this meet. It's one of my least favorite categories. Circles and spheres, I'm putting it C. There's a lot of formulas, and there's way too many formulas to memorize. It's just a lot of formulas. And I mean, the spheres part isn't too bad because it's really just understanding that the sphere can just be a cross section of a circle, and then you're really just dealing with a circle. So that's not too bad, but just so many formulas. Connets. Everyone knows where I'm going to put connets. F tier. It's horrible. Connets are crazy. Yeah, the 3-pointers are doable, but you have to complete the square twice to do them. So, like, they're doable, the 3-pointers. You get past that, and I'm sorry. Without a cheat sheet in hand, I cannot do the rest. Connets are absolutely horrible. They are absolute F tier. If I was in charge of mammal, I probably wouldn't even have connets, but I'm not, so they're there, and they're horrible. We practice them, but they're very difficult, and I learned them in Algebra 2 in high school, but we don't cover them anymore in high school. I haven't seen a curriculum in quite a while that had them. So, yeah, connets are horrible. And then arithmetic with statistics, which is actually the bright part of Meet 5, and honestly the only one that I think is actually doable. And that's going to be thrown up in S tier. Arithmetic with statistics. Again, it's arithmetic, and it's calculator active. So a lot of the stuff can be just done with a calculator, and it's knowing mean, median, and mode. As long as you know what mean, median, and mode are, and possibly range, and possibly even quartiles and an interquartile range, like that's probably the hardest stuff arithmetic with statistics deals with, is quartiles and interquartile range. And that stuff really isn't that bad because it's just the median of the median. So knowing mean, median, and mode and range, those are super easy to figure out. And it's, especially with a calculator, it's a really easy category and the only bright spot of Meet 5. All right. That's my tier list. You can see I have a lot in the S and a lot in the C. There's a lot of categories I think are really easy and really fun, but they're kind of mixed in different spots and everywhere. But then I also think there's a lot of categories that aren't too bad, but really are harder than they need to be. So And then there are others in different areas. I filled at least one in every category. I saved the F tier specifically for Connets because that's how bad Connets is. It is exponentially worse than any of the D tiers. But you see, there's a lot of stuff up top. The S, A, and B tiers really aren't that bad. And come in during one of those practices, and I think you'll have a lot of fun. And, like, not have to do a lot of, like, really big brain math thinking, and probably even feel pretty good about yourself getting some math team problems because they're really not super horrible. All right, so I actually created a template for this. So if anyone else wants to create their own math team category tier list, they can. I will put the link in the description. But have fun with it. If you greatly disagree with me, feel free on creating this and sharing it, and sharing it with me. And like, if you completely disagree with anything, let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. And biggest thing about this is join Math Team. Math Team is a lot of fun. I know there are a lot of categories that can be really difficult, and even I may not be a super fan of some of them. Connets. But a lot of these categories are really fun, and it's just a lot of fun, and you do them with fun people, and we have lots of snaps, and it's just a lot of fun. Join Math Team. Just reach out to me by email, coming up to me, whatever. Just showing up to a practice. Math Team is a lot of fun. I really hope a lot of people join from me posting this video. And that's it. That's all I've got. So join Math Team and have a good night.